If you could wave a magic wand and fix one thing in how companies approach custom software, what would it be?
Preconceived notions. The reason to use custom software is that you have a problem that is more specific, more unique, and therefore there's a more efficient solution. Custom software will never be faster, it will never be cheaper. And so what I wish people would think about is how can it be more efficient and more cost effective?
Piggyback on that. If you remember all these CSI shows where they have this computer analyst that goes in there and they can erase somebody's footprint, just click and boom. If I could do that, what I would erase is the phrase off-the-shelf software. Because my goodness, nothing comes more loaded with preconceived notions than someone who heard there was an off-the-shelf solution. And it's just nearly impossible in a quick conversation to say the things that need to be said to prove the point that there is no real off-the-shelf solution. There might be a piece of off-the-shelf software, and you may be able to customize that and make it kind of fit. But at the end of the day, what it ends up looking like is an awful lot like the kind of time and money and effort you spend to build a custom solution that fits like a glove the first time.
Metaphorically, it's the difference between off-the-shelf clothing and custom clothing.
Yeah.
Like a glove. A piece of off-the-shelf clothing may be adequate, but ultimately you are taking your time and energy to fit yourself to the product and decide whether it's good enough. Whereas a piece of custom clothing is made express fit to purpose.
Yeah. And like the way we wear clothing a lot, sometimes the it's good enough fits a purpose. But when we're trying to make money, when we're trying to run, when we are trying to do what we do better than our competitors, buying the same clothing that the guy next to us is wearing doesn't cut it. In a studio model, the costume needs to fit the scene. It needs to fit what's being communicated. It needs to fit. They don't just run through Target to get their clothing and to get their costumes. They custom make all of that stuff.
They sure do.
So why does it matter to have a clear process like the studio model?
We decided to define our project management and our development processes, our design processes with the studio model because we felt like a lot of the software metaphors weren't well understood by our customers. And we also felt like there's a very strong resonance with the well-exercised process of creating custom from scratch intellectual property in the studio world, movies, TV shows, etc. And it's really just a better fit. The importance of having a process that is well-defined is to correlate your internal communication and your internal actions with your external expectations and your external outcomes. And the studio model really helps us to do that.
I think it helps us to put things in other words because like every industry, there's so much jargon associated with the process of writing software. And there isn't a lot of understanding that what's desired at the end of the day is a solution to something and not just that there's code. And so it's hard to introduce the need for discussions and meetings and discovery when we're not thinking about it and couching it from how are we solving a problem. If we're talking tech jargon, it's almost a natural thing to start talking about the code. And really, what we really want to try to get away from is double clicking into code talk too much, because people don't really have a way of thinking about it that is common, that we all share. Versus the studio model, we all feel like we kind of understand these terms, and that gets them talking about things in terms of a production and what this looks like, not just how it acts. And so it is a wonderful common metaphor and a space to just talk about the problem and the solution outside of the jargon, which tends to get us to think about just code.
I think something I really appreciate about our practice of the studio model is that it's really not about the process. The point is the outcome. The point is the episode. It's what are we trying to accomplish? And then the various pathways we take to get there. It's not focused on the exercise of the process itself.
Why do we stay in discovery mode longer than most firms probably do?
I think, again, to kind of piggyback on the discussion about the studio model as a metaphor and how it aids in communication, in the jargon that we use, in the technical terms that we use to describe the solution, the discovery mode gets us away from talking about code and talking about the final solution and allows us to spend a little time in the space of define the problem for us, please. Double click on that and define why that's a problem. All right, in light of why that's a problem, how do you see a solution really working? Unpacking those things in a way that allows the customer to imagine what the solution would be like and give us more really important detail about how they would want this solution to look for them, allowing us to make decisions now that it used to be before we had the studio model, before we had this longer discovery process, we would find upon delivery. It's kind of the kid in the candy shop thing. On delivery, all of a sudden they realize, oh, this new world has opened up to me. What if we also did this? What if we also did that? And we would frequently find ourselves saying, I wish we had known that. We're only discovering now on delivery that there was so much more we could have done. So this really does help get out ahead of some of those almost buyer's remorse, really. Almost this thought that had I known that this was possible, had I known that you were going to solve my problem this way, I might have imagined more or dreamed more or had a bigger ambition. And so I enjoy that moment with the customer before there's a payment, before there's a regret that I didn't think and say and do. It's almost as if we can kind of dream big dreams together. The whetting of the appetite of them seeing and imagining what the solution looks like often brings out much better version one experiences and software deliverables and things like that than I think it did when we were in a rush to build the first thing.
Yeah, I don't know that we stay in discovery mode longer than other firms. I think our guideline is we stay in discovery mode long enough to understand the story. And until we can articulate the story well enough that we can present a vision that engages the customer's interest and solves the problem at hopefully a deeper level than they were even able to imagine themselves, we know we're not done. So we try to stay in discovery mode until we hit that point where we really get the story and we have that key insight into how to move forward.
It is fair to say, though, we spend much more time in discovery than we used to, for sure.
That is for sure true.
I know there are several times where we get approached with a problem and it looks like what's needed here is some instant action, some triage, some very fast remedy. And I think nowadays there's almost an allergy you and I have developed over time to wanting to jump at that opportunity. There may be situations where we could be talked into it, but I think we both tend to want to take that deep breath, want to unpack possibilities with them and get them to think a little bit more down the road than let's jump on this and hope that the solution and the wonderfulness of it all gives us a V1 and a V2 and a V3. We found too many times before that instant solution, that instant Band-Aid never came off, and we never got to V2 and V3 because that piece of software was delivered and they moved on too fast.
But I think what you're actually saying there is that we stay in discovery mode longer because of old age.
That may be. Fair point.
So when it comes to the studio model, why don't we start with something like the user's journey?
Why don't we start with the user's journey? I think the problem with starting with the user's journey is you assume that you know what the user's journey is. You maybe are assuming that you understand where that user's headed or what the goal is or what key steps are along the way. And I think we've found time and time again that customers understand aspects of the problem and they understand aspects of their goals and ambitions very well, but they usually aren't taking a broad enough or a holistic enough look at the totality of the story. And so we really need to understand the story, the setting, the context before we can get to those user journeys. And those user journeys come often in the second meeting, but we really prefer not to try to land a user's journey in that first initial conversation. We miss stuff when we do.
I guess it's almost like tracing the art, where here's the problem and here's the shape of the problem, and we stick a thin film over it and we trace the problem. We really haven't grown. We really haven't expanded. We really haven't looked at the problem from 9 different angles. And so I think the user's journey is huge. It's an important part of it, but to stay on that is there's no movement and growth, and there's no excellence in that.
What's the value of the pilot episode?
I think the pilot episode is, first of all, the phrase is great because I think it encapsulates an awful lot that needs to be communicated about how to get started. And again, in a vernacular that people feel like they understand. And it's just a quick way of saying, this isn't everything, and this isn't all the things, but this is enough of the thing where we whet our appetites, we get an idea of what to expect, and we get a sense of where we're going. Now, I think the important aspect for us in the pilot episode is we need to understand our customer better and what their expectations are. They need to understand us better, how we work, how we communicate. And there's almost like a how do we get used to this dance partner moment in all of these projects where the pilot episode is super important. Who's leading? What moves do we make? What the heck dance are we picking here anyway? And so I feel like the pilot episode in a vernacular way is a great way to establish a cadence and establish a metaphor that we can use to talk. But I think in practice, the pilot episode really sets us up for being a valuable partner for this person and learning how to be a techno asset and an advocate for them, not just a vendor.
Yeah, I think that's right. One of the challenges with defining a pilot episode is that once an organization has finally decided to pull the trigger and move forward with a custom solution, the pain is typically so acute and the potential relief, the airing of that pilot episode is so anticipated that everyone wants the pilot episode to be all things to all people. And there's a real danger there because if the pilot episode tries to be too complete, it often ends up being the only episode to the detriment of all. And so the real challenge is finding the right bit of that story that greenlights the series, that sets it up, that has just enough to justify the rest of the effort, but doesn't try to solve all the problems at once. And that's a challenge. It's a different answer every time, but it's tricky finding that correct pilot episode.
I think you had brought up in past conversations about how to build big things and breaking down the problem and solving things in a sequence and with a purpose is a difficult exercise. It's hard to do. It's hard to think that way. And I like having the customer come along for that ride. And I like them being on the team of, hey, we agree with you. Let's break this up. Let's think about this in a stepwise manner, because I feel like that sets them up for the pattern of thinking that needs to fall in accomplish anything big, which is, how do we sequentially think about this? How do we meter things out so that the right project hits at the right time for this to be fruitful and to be a good thing? And so I like trying to, as quickly as we can, get the customer into this cadence of episodic ordering and building big things. And it's a discipline that we have to learn together with a new client every single time. It's a brand new discipline every time.
Yeah, it's a different way of thinking about solving problems, though. It's not, what is the one thing that has everything I need? It's, what's the most important thing? And then what do we do after that?
How do we use personas to guide design decisions when it comes to the studio model?
Personas are important for a very large number of reasons why, but the first one that comes to mind is, how do we abstract the problem and get it out of it being this person or this department or this role? How do we get it outside of that and look at the project in a broader sense? So much about building software is about data. So much about data is really about databases and storing this data. And it's so abstract to break things into data pieces and talk about them. And you lose the customer extremely quickly in that process. And so taking the project, breaking it into personas and what that specific persona needs to thrive and function. Again, it gets it out of the person's space and allows them to talk about it in a little bit more of an abstract and less personal way. But it also helps us to very quickly hear from them, where does the data flow from? Where does the data flow to? Where are these problem points that they are experiencing? And it allows us to break the project up. It certainly gives us a wealth of material to circle back on and double click on and make sure we're not missing anything. A lot of times in a discovery process, I feel like I get a really early sense of, I know what this is going to look like. I have a feeling how this database should look. And it's really in those personas where I realize, man, I'm thinking too small. This is actually a bigger problem. And so I think they're a really important tool for both sides, but they really do just aid in good, clear communication that is a little bit more abstract and not quite, it doesn't turn into a blame game for the person that's bringing up the need for the solution. And it allows the stakeholders to look at their people with a little bit more empathy and a little bit more sense of, this is how this person is part of this solution, not this is how this person is part of the problem.
How do we use personas to guide design decisions?
A persona. What is a persona? So a persona is a person, not a specific person, but an understanding of a person. It's their biases, their aspirations, their limits, all of those kind of things that make up a person. And so when we're trying to design software, it's really important to understand the person, the character, when we tell that story. We're not designing software for engineers. That's the real danger with software, is software engineers design software that makes sense to software engineers. That's very frustrating for users. We really like to understand that persona, keep it in mind when designing software. And I think the most challenging personas, in my opinion, are often the less technical or the outside users, maybe the public users. Those have been some of our most difficult personas to really understand and address effectively. Why do you think that is?
I think where we run into trouble is putting a person in the middle of the solution in the discussion. And that person has their quirks and their thoughts and their what they do. And that isn't always the best way to solve a problem, because putting it into a framework of a persona allows us to talk with a little bit more freedom about what ought that role and that persona be doing, and what is the information that persona, right? That person, when they're actually doing that role with that persona, what ought they be funding us with data wise, and what ought they be taking away, and get it out of the kind of sticky mess of what people think about that person or what people think about that job. It may be that the person doing that bit of work at that company isn't that person doing that bit of work anymore, because they realize, wow, that was my role. The persona really needs to be done by this person over here. It allows us to move things around a little bit more. And it also allows the customer a little bit more freedom to discuss the problem and the solution in a light that isn't quite so personal and isn't quite so specific.
Yeah, I think sometimes it gives us the ability to allow each persona to be the hero of their part of the story. Where if we think about users, especially from a software engineer's perspective, the user is often not seen as the hero. Sometimes we think of users as troublesome or uninformed. But if we realize that what we need to do is understand the persona and how do we honor and elevate them and make them the hero of their part of the story, we can start to solve those problems more effectively and elegantly.
I think also our customers have customers. And the reason why our customers may be in the situation they're in, thriving to death and having a lot of work and needing a more systemized way of doing things, is their customers value their input. Their customers value what they bring to the game. And so to think about what we're delivering as just a software, just a solution that is a solution for our customers, a lot of times we're empowering our customers to be better solution providers to their end customers. And so we think about the person and we might provide them a tool. We think about the persona, we can put a cape on that and we can make them the hero of that story. And now they are providing a better service for their end customer, and they are seeing the value of not only the solution as it comes to them, but see the value of thinking about things in terms of studio model, in terms of stories, in terms of plot lines, all that kind of stuff. They can start to imagine a bigger world than just simply, I run things through a software program.
What are we still learning about how to improve the studio model?
I think what we're learning about improving the studio model is it's different every time. And so the challenge, of course, is what matters, what frameworks, what words, what vocabulary, what processes do we maintain versus every new series, to use the metaphor, every new series that we produce with a customer brings with it new challenges. Sometimes we're writing those stories differently. Sometimes metaphorically, the location is entirely new and has different challenges. The technologies are different and shift. And I think for me lately, the real balancing act is, what do we hang on to that's consistent over time? And then what do we feel the freedom to reinvent? And I think the studio model gives us a lot of flexibility to do both.
I think in a real production studio where you're actually filming and things, you will have movies, you'll have shows where the scenery is maybe one of the characters, or the plot line isn't really so much character focused as it is incident focused. And then you have those episodes where it's super focused in on a customer or a character or an aspect of a personality or whatever. And those kinds of intricacies play themselves out in that space in ways that we're familiar with. But it's true about software too. We have customers where their product is very much customer service to their end customers. They are very much high touch. People are our business. What my customers think of me and the service I provide makes or breaks the bank. But we have also customers that are more in the widget space, and they're just creating things and they're just cranking them out, and their needs are different. And so we have to be more facile at changing up what we focus on and what we discuss and try to flesh out using studio model language, because it's not the same formula. There's no cookie cutter way of looking at customer A and customer B and saying that we're gonna walk you through this studio model in this stepwise fashion and we can't deviate. There are parts of the studio model we just completely skip for customer B, but holy cow, we double clicked and spent a long time there with customer A. And yeah, I think you're right. The sense of which the studio model is not a rigid rubric. It is a way of talking about things. It is a metaphor, and it plays out and it resonates with customers in an entirely different way. And it behooves us to lean in on those moments. If this is really resonating with this customer, we really need to lean in and spend more time there, because they're going to be excited to take delivery of that when we've talked about it in a way that gets their creative juices flowing and gets them feeling like they're buying in.
Ready for that premiere.
Yeah, but they can't wait.
If you could describe the essence of the studio model in one word, what would it be and why?
I have my one word. Are you ready?
Go ahead.
So I think, first of all, anyone who's had more than one conversation with me knows that there is always more than one word coming out of my mouth. So this is hard. But I feel like that one word for me is empathy. And I say that because the point of the studio model is that we're frameworking this in a way that allows us to communicate better with our client. That comes from a place of empathy. But it also allows us to have a conversation with them and hear from them things that aren't just merely technical in nature. And that is because we feel like by empathizing with our client and their problem and the milieu of issues and conditions and things that comprise why they're knocking on our door to begin with, the more we empathize with that, the more we will be working with a partner in the solution as opposed to just a simple client relationship.
I like that. I think the one word that comes to my mind with the studio model, and I think this is more the practice of the studio model and less the hopefully outcome and intentionality of the studio model, is simply story. It's that the goal is to know the story, tell the story, and perpetuate the story. At its best, when we really get the story right, it goes on season after season and evolves in ways that none of the participants at the beginning could have ever imagined. And it's a wonderful journey to go on. So story is my one word, but I love empathy because part of getting the story right is it has to have empathy with the characters in that story.
Oh, I like story as well. First of all, everyone likes a good story, right? But to framework a discussion and to framework a problem within the context of story does a lot to help you establish rapport and help them realize they're in the middle of this story too. They're not just simply telling a story, they're in a story. And so when we can get in a room with them and dream big dreams and they hear it in this story fashion, I think we get a lot more out of them. And quite frankly, I like that as a, what do I do as a vocation, more than I write software.
We're storytellers.
That's right.
How do we create a space where both our team and the client can be candid and collaborative?
It takes a lot of trust, which is built over time. Hopefully, at the beginning of that discovery phase to design that pilot episode, that trust is built from the first sentence, from the first moment. But really, in our experience, once people start to believe that they are being heard, that their journey, their ambitions, their struggles are reflected back in the story and the personas and the ideas that we're talking about, they're very free with their communication. They're very free to tell us when we're right and when we're wrong. And there's an opportunity to struggle together towards the right story, the right solution to any given challenge.
I think that trust is the perfect dynamic that you're teasing out of that, because I think software has taken a rap for a while. And I liken to the customer that comes to us with a problem is maybe almost to how they go to their doctor, right? Especially maybe a new doctor. Is this going to hurt? I know this is going to hurt. I know that this is going to be painful. I really don't want to talk about this. They don't want to be there. And I think a lot of times software guys, just people in that space, they see code and they deliver things that don't always work. The number of times people come to us with war stories from the previous guys, the previous company, the previous solution. And it's hard. It is hard to just smile and go, we're not them. That means nothing. The doctor telling you right before the syringe goes in, this isn't going to hurt. That means nothing. Nobody believes that. So I think the trust factor is huge, because you and I really do feel like we want to help this customer. The more they feel like they were listened to and that their problem was solved, the more they're going to want to come back for more and talk about and dream bigger things and do more things. I think we like our customers to be in that space. We don't like the antagonistic, why are you billing me for this? Why does this cost so much? We don't like those conversations. And so the story framework is perfect for establishing trust as early on as we can.
So why did we create our own framework, the studio model, instead of just using one of the multitude of frameworks that exist in the technology software space?
Why did we create our own framework? My recollection is when, for the umpteenth time, we had built some amazing thing that yet another customer had paid luxuriously for, and then it didn't go into production, or it wasn't as successful as we would like, or the person that had told us what we should build was not the person actually having to use it, and the person who had to use it hated it. So when for the umpteenth time this happened, it became clear to us that success was not predicated on cashing the check. That really wasn't what we were looking for. What we were looking for was that surprise and delight of an actual user, one of our personas, being listened to and being empowered to solve their problem. And that takes more than just developing software.
I think it's absolutely right. And I have so many of the incidences that you were referring to just flashing through my mind. And one that sticks out in my mind was the 2 or 3 meetings we had with a potential client where we talked shop and we got into all of these software packages and programming languages and technologies that we could leverage. And they were excited and we were excited, and then they just vanished. And we're left to wonder, what didn't we communicate with them? What did we miss? It maybe for valid reasons they just disappeared, but maybe there was something they didn't feel like we established with them, whether it was a true understanding of the problem or we didn't framework the solution in a way that made us seem unique enough, and so they just shopped our idea. There were so many questions about those experiences and why didn't this land? And so we really started groping around for ways to talk about this. And I think over the years, you and I have used the building a house or construction as a metaphor. There's all these kinds of metaphors, but I think the one that in general people feel like they understand without really even necessarily understanding it is the studio model, is the how does a TV show get filmed and how does a movie get filmed? And I think there's enough behind the scenes things in the end of movies and all that. I think people feel like they understand it, and they certainly feel comfortable talking about it in that framework. And I think we landed there through a lot of mistakes made and a lot of bad communication over the years. Just as a desire, how do we communicate better? And how do we actually get from our customer the information we need to actually be an effective consultant and advocate? And instead of walking away from those conversations wondering if we hit the mark.
Yeah, that's right. We realized that it wasn't just that middle part of making the software or shooting the episode. If you're going to build software, you have to design it. And thinking from the framework of telling a story in the studio model, you can't start filming that episode until you've written the episode, until you've set the stage for the episode, until you understand what's not in that episode and what's going to be in other episodes. So there's some pre-production work that we understood that we needed to do more deeply. You can't air the episode until the episode's done and it's edited. And it has the music added and the credits put at the end. And oftentimes in software, there's this race to the finish, and we're trying to take software live before it's even complete. And you can't take software live successfully without airing it, without giving it to people, without onboarding them, without explaining it, without documenting it, without inviting them in. So there's post-production that is often left as the ugly stepchild in the software world that really needs its own care and feeding, its own careful attention for success. And so the studio model is really a fairly simple idea. It's just let each phase have its own moment and give it its appropriate effort and its appropriate concentration, and success follows.
It does.